This content is not suitable for children and may contain depictions of violence.
Hi, I'm your host, Cambo. Grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. This is True Crime Island, another true crime podcast. Hi, Islanders. I hope you're all well. Tonight, we have another serial killer, this time from England, well, from Scotland actually. Now, he preyed on homeless young men, offering them a bed for the night, but then brutally strangled, drowned, and then he'd wank himself when they were dead. Now, he was nicknamed the British Jeffrey Dahmer, but he was also known as the Muswell Hill Murderer and the Kindly Killer. Of course, we're talking about Dennis Nilsen, and a big shout out to Truman, who suggested this case. Now, my references tonight are Paul Sutherland from the True Crime Enthusiast podcast. So if you haven't heard of Paul's podcast, you should give it a try. It's really good. Also, the Murder Mile podcast by Michael J. Buchanan Dunn, another podcast to look out for. And Michael, he actually performs walks around London's murder miles. And hopefully he'll be able to start this up again this year if the flu dies down a bit. My other references, The Independent UK, BBC, the Sacramento Bee, the Leaf Chronicle, the Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Observer, The Age, and an audio book I got called Killing for Company by Brian Masters, and also The Sun. Okay, so many of you may already know of Nilsen, some of which may have watched the miniseries called Des, which for the life of me I couldn't find to stream online, but I actually bought the DVD this week and had a watch of it. Anyway, on the 30th of December 1978, at age 23, Nilsen would meet up with a very young guy who he thought was around 17 years old. Now, this was at the Cricklewood Arms pub. Actually, it was just a boy of 14 years. What would happen that night and the next day would change the course of Nilsen's life forever. Dennis Andrew Nilsen, or Des as he was known, and that's the name of the video, was born on the 23rd of November 1945 at Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Now, that's about an hour's drive north of Aberdeen. He was the second of three children born to Elizabeth White and Olive Moxheim. His father, Olav, was a Norwegian soldier who'd fled to Scotland during World War II when the Germans occupied Norway. Now, he's part of the Free Norwegian Forces, and when he married Elizabeth, they stayed at her parents' place. Now, he was pretty involved with the Norwegian Free Forces, and he tended to neglect his marriage and his family. They were divorced in 1948 when Dennis was only 3 years old. But Nilsen was close to his grandfather. They went on long walks and they hung out together. But at age 62, while working as a fisherman in the North Sea, his grandfather died of a heart attack. Now, his body was brought back to the family home, and when Nilsen, and he was only 6 years old at the time, viewed him, he was told his grandfather was sleeping and going to a better place. Now, Nilsen waited and waited and then realised his beloved grandfather was never going to return. Now, the loss of his grandfather would shape Nilsen probably more than any other event in his early life. The loss of someone he was so close to and loved so much, it was deeply etched into his psyche. At around 10 years old, he nearly drowned, but was saved by another kid. Now, as he felt himself drift away, he thought of his grandfather coming to save him. Now, as he got older, he realised he was gay. Although he was attracted to other boys, he really didn't act on any of the urges. Remembering this is in the mid-50s and homosexuality was not a thing you carried on about or came out about. It wouldn't be until 1967 for homosexual acts to become legal in most of the UK, and it wasn't until 1981 that it was legal in Scotland. Now, comment below if I'm wrong, but that's what I found online. Now, his mum ended up marrying again in 1955 and had 4 more kids. They moved to Striken, I don't know, in Aberdeenshire. They were poorer than most and he just wanted to get out. He thought of it as a bit of a shithole. Now, that's my words, not his. And it was a place with not much to do and no real future for him. At school, he joined the Army Cadets as he thought that one day the Army would be his ticket out of striking. And join the Army he did. He was only 16 and he trained in the south of England at the Aldershot Barracks. Nilsen enjoyed Army life. After the loss of his grandfather and the emptiness and loneliness that followed, he now felt part of a hard-working team. He would train in the catering corps, which gave him skills in butchery that he would put to great effect in later life. Although he was relatively happy in the army, he still felt guilty having gay feelings and tried to reconcile this in his mind that he was probably bisexual rather than homosexual. Yeah, with the army there's lots of drinking and drinking until you pass out. Now, Nilsen fantasised over the passed out bodies of his mates and he would also fake being passed out in the hope that he would be groped. He would do this in later life as well. In the later army days, he had a room to himself where he could whack off in private, and he worked out that if he stood in the mirror in the right way, he could fantasise he was actually having sex with another bloke. Nilsen spent just over 11 years in the army, rising to the rank of corporal, and he probably could have gone a bit further. But during his time, he had many homosexual encounters outside the army, but he was frustrated when he got feelings for a young soldier that grew stronger, but he knew would never come of nothing would come of it. Sorry, I'm getting the words wrong. He left the army because of his political persuasions of the time, actually. Now, they put him at conflict with the army's operations in Northern Ireland at the time. Now, just off topic, and some of the UK Islanders might know, and you can comment below, but even in 1994, when I was backpacking and working in London, often you would be on the tube and the train would stop and everyone would have to evacuate because someone had left their bag on the train. Now, it would have to be checked out in case it was an IRA bomb. Now, I don't know if that still happens, but of course it's probably from a different group nowadays. Anyway, after leaving the army, he went home to Scotland, but this was short-lived because he had a fight with his brother about being gay. Nilsen went back to London in late 1972. In April 73, he joined the police force, hoping to get that air of camaraderie that he got in the army. But it just wasn't to be. Where the army life was filled with discipline and everyone worked as a tight-knit group, the police force just wasn't the same. Now, once he finished work, he was alone. He filled his lack of company by frequenting gay bars around London. Now, according to Paul from the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, and this is where I got the list from, there was the Golden Lion and the Salisbury pub in Leicester Square, the Colburn Arms in Earl's Court, the Black Cat in Camden Town, and the King William IV pub in Hampstead. Plus, there was the Cricklewood Arms in Cricklewood. Now, that's just to name a few. However, the relationships Nilsen had were either one-night stands or they just didn't go anywhere. He was looking for a long-term relationship, not one where his lover would leave him the next morning. Now, after leaving the police force, Nilsen found some work as a security guard until he landed a civil servant position at a job centre in Denmark Street, Charing Cross. At this stage, Nilsen lived at 80 Tynemouth Road, Cricklewood, around the corner from Willesden Green Station. It's here that he met 20-year-old David Gallican, who was being hassled outside a pub by a couple of blokes. Now, Nilsen intervened and they ended up going back to his house. They got along well and decided to move into a bigger place together at 195 Melrose Avenue, just around the corner. Now, the ground floor flat had a garden in the back that Nilsen asked to have exclusive use of in the terms of the rental agreement. Now, this relationship became strained, and after a year they stayed living together, but eventually they slept in different rooms and would end up bringing home casual partners. By May of 1977, Gallican left and formally ended the relationship. So again, Nilsen was alone. He felt unworthy as a partner he was drinking to excess and tried to blank all of this out of his mind by working hard at the job centre. Okay, so now things start to get a little crazy. On the 30th of December 1978, Nilsen was drinking at the Cricklewood Arms when he noticed a young man being refused service. Now, he approached the guy and he believed him to be about 17 years old. Well, that's what he says. And Nilsen was about 33 at this time. Now, he offered this guy drinks back at his place. They ended up getting drunk and passed out in bed. In the morning, Nilsen was afraid to wake his sleeping friend because he feared he would leave him. Nilsen grabbed a tie that was on the floor. He put it around the guy's neck and then he straddled him as he tightened the tie. Now, the young guy woke up and they struggled, falling onto the floor. Eventually, Nilsen got the upper hand and the body went limp, but wasn't dead. So Nilsen went to the kitchen, got a full bucket of water and pushed his partner's head in it until there was no more bubbles. He then smoked a cigarette and made coffee. The dog came into the bedroom and sniffed the dead man. Now, Nilsen ran a bath and he washed the body. He then pulled him out of the bath and sat him on the dunny, or the toilet for other countries other than Australia. The dunny. He then took him to the bedroom and put him on the bed. Now, Nilsen expected the police to be knocking at his door at any time once this young man was noticed missing. But this didn't happen. He went into town and bought an electric carving knife with the intentions of cutting up the body. Now, he didn't use it for this. Instead, he ended up taking it to work for Cake Day. Anyway, Nilsen dressed the body and placed him in the bed and hugged him. Now, he did try to have anal sex with the corpse, but he couldn't maintain a hard-on, so he decided to put the body under the floorboards. Now, at this stage, he couldn't because of rigor mortis. He gathered up the young man's clothes and threw them out in the bin. Now, once the body had become pliable again, he stuck him under the floor. Now, later, he took the body out again and washed it in the bath. He took it into the bedroom where he admired the youthfulness of the body and he ended up wanking himself over it. He later suspended the body upside down and he was wanking himself again, and he would do this often. Now, when he finished, he put the body back under the floorboards. Nilsen would then meet Martin Hunter Craig. Martin would become his only friend. Martin said he had a great laugh and he was fun to be around. But Martin led a bit of a nomadic life. He had no permanent address and couch surfed wherever he could get a place to stay. Now, they met one afternoon in Soho and Nilsen asked if he wanted pizzas and to go for drinks. Now, Martin told him he had no money, but Nilsen was happy to pay. Nilsen then asked if he wanted to go back for coffee to his house, and Martin agreed. Nilsen was about 32 or 33 at this stage, and Martin was only in his early 20s. They then had a casual affair, but Martin didn't see him as a lover, rather he saw him as an elder brother. He knew he couldn't love him, but he liked spending time with him, saying he could sleep with him, but nothing more than that. So Martin didn't live with Dennis, rather he would only stay with him when he was in London. Martin said Nilsen would sometimes play dead, collapsing in a heap on the floor with his arms out. Martin knew he was faking it, he just thought it was weird and wondered if Nilsen wanted to take advantage of him. Now, Martin also reckoned he was never a victim because he tolerated his weirdness and would always have a comeback if something weird or rude was said by Nilsen. He said Nilsen seemed to like someone having control over him. Also, Nilsen knew Martin would leave, but he would always come back to visit, unlike his one-night stands. Anyway, on the 11th of August 1979, 7 months after the killing of his first victim and storing the body under the floorboards, he would dispose of the body by burning it in the backyard with rubber tyres to disguise the smell. He then pounded the ashes into powder and raked them into the ground. Now, the name of this young man wouldn't be known until 2006, as Nilsen had forgotten it. It was Stephen Holmes, Not 17 as Nilsen had thought, or said he thought. Stephen was only 14 years old. After the killing of Holmes, Nilsen had thoughts that maybe he should give himself up to police. He didn't quite feel like doing it again. He felt terrified of what consequences would come if the police came knocking. But in October of 1979, Nilsen met up with Andrew Ho, a young Chinese guy. Now, they went back to his place and they were discussing participating in some sort of BDSM. Now, Andrew went along with it as he wanted money, he expected to get paid, and he didn't mind a bit of bondage. But then Nilsen tried to use a necktie to strangle Andrew, and in the resultant struggle, Andrew was able to break free and he ran out of the house. He then called the cops and told them of the attack. They attended 195 Melrose Avenue, but nothing further happened. The cops probably putting it down to some queer rough play, just gone a little bit too far. Then on December the 3rd, 1979, Canadian student Kenneth Ockenden had been staying at the Central Hotel in Argyle Street, London. He went out with his camera to take tourist pickies. Now, he met Nilsen at lunchtime in a West End pub. Nilsen had a few hours off work, and so they decided that they'd have a couple of rounds of drinks and toured the city, taking photos and feeding pigeons. Now, in the late afternoon, they decided to go back to his place to eat and then go out again for drinks. Now, after eating, they decided to go and buy booze and drink back at Nilsen's place. Now, Kenneth was due to fly home to Canada the next day. However, he would never go back to his hotel or make his flight. Although they had a great time together that day, Nilsen couldn't get out of his mind the fact that Kenneth was going to leave. Now, Nilsen strangled him with the cord from a set of headphones he was wearing while listening to music. He would strip him and He would strip him and bathe him and then put him in his bed and sleep with him. The next day, he put him in the cupboard and went to work. He bought a cheap Polaroid camera on his way home. Now, he took his body out of the cupboard, sat him on a kitchen chair, put undies, shirt and socks on him. He arranged Kenneth's body in several positions and took photos. Nilsen then took Kenneth's body to bed and laid on top of him while he watched TV. Now, Nilsen would speak to him during this TV watching. He then had sex between Kenneth's thighs. He then put Kenneth under the floorboards. Now, over the next few weeks, he would take Kenneth from the floorboards, sit him in a chair and watch TV with him, returning his body back under the floorboards. The coldness under the floor helped keep the body fresh. Now, Kenneth would be reported missing, one of only a few of Nilsen's victims. 16-year-old Martin Duffy would be Nilsen's next victim. He was a troubled youth who had run away from his Birkenhead home near Liverpool at 15 years of age. He hung out at gay bars and took Valium. He seemed to be getting his life back on the rails though, getting a job, returning home, studying catering, and he even got himself a girlfriend. But then he was busted fare evading by the cops, and this seemed to fuck him up a little bit. He packed his things and told his family he was going to live in New Brighton, and that's not that far away, it's up the road. However, they lost touch with him after the 13th of May 1980. He ended up in London, sleeping rough, until he met Nilsen. Nilsen offered for him to stay at his place, and Martin agreed. After only a couple of beers, Martin crawled into bed. Then Nilsen straddled him and strangled him until he was unconscious. Nilsen then carried him downstairs where he filled the sink with water and held his head under for about 3 minutes until he was dead. He then stripped him and took him into the bathroom. This time Nilsen lay in the bath as well, with Martin's body on top of him. Nilsen then took him and sat him on a kitchen chair, dried him off and placed him on the bed. Nilsen spoke to Martin, telling his corpse that he was the youngest that he'd ever seen. He kissed him all over and held him, and then again he wanked himself on Martin's stomach. He stored him in the cupboard until he started to bloat, and then he put him under the floorboards. Nilsen's fourth victim would be 27-year-old Billy Sutherland, a heavily tattooed and heavy drinker from Edinburgh. Billy had been to juvie and to prison. In Scotland, he had a girlfriend and a baby. But when he went to London, he would sleep from place to place and with men for money. Even though he was a bit of a bad boy, he would always keep in touch with his mum. In May of 1980, he met Nilsen in a pub in Piccadilly Circus, then went on a pub crawl ending up at Charing Cross Road. Nilsen was pretty pissed and decided to go home. Now, as he got to Leicester Square station, he noticed Billy had followed him, with Billy telling him that he just had nowhere to sleep. Now, probably because he was pissed, Nilsen has no recollection on how he killed Billy, saying that he saw a dead body on the floor when he woke the next day and that it had been strangled. Billy's mum notified police that her son had not been in contact with her and he was listed as a missing person. Now, at the time, there were 40 other missing Billy Sutherlands on record at that time. Now, the next few murders, Nilsen has little or no recollection of who they were. Now, this would be because of a combination of the victims being drifters or not having regular contact with others, and that their remains would be virtually eliminated. Probably he was drinking heavily at the time as well. It's around this stage that Nilsen had run out of room to store bodies. He would leave their soft tissue for rats and foxes to eat and burn whatever was left using tyres to disguise the smell. Now, I can't imagine the smell inside his flat. He did use joss sticks, or some call them incense sticks, to cover up the smell, along with air fresheners. Now, he would spray insecticide to help keep the maggots in the bodies under control. It's said that the most he ever had under the floorboards at any one time was 6 bodies. So, as I said, there isn't much info on the next victims. Nilsen's 5th victim was probably a Thai or Philo male sex worker. The 6th was probably an Irish labourer. The 7th was a starving hippie type he found sleeping in a doorway at Charing Cross, and he could recall nothing about the 8th victim. The 9th and 10th victims were young Scottish men that he'd met in pubs in Soho. Now, his 11th victim was a punk skinhead he picked up in Piccadilly Circus. He had a neck tattoo which said "cut here," and later that night Nilsen did just that. Now, victim 12 was 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow from Sheffield. Now, Malcolm was epileptic and forever on government assistance. In fact, he was known to know the government assistance, or DHSS, procedures like the back of his hand. He could bring on epileptic fits when he required it to get sympathy. His parents were dead and he had no friends. He was a liar and he would do anything for money, including blackmail and sleep with blokes. Now, he was lying on the footpath near Nilsen's house on the 17th of September 1981. When Nilsen saw him as he walked past on his way to work, he asked if he was okay. Now, Malcolm said he was having side effects from his epilepsy medicine, and Nilsen took him back to his place for a cup of tea while he went down the street and called 999 for an ambulance. You see, back then, not everyone had a phone in their house, so he went down the phone box. Now, Malcolm was taken to Park Royal Hospital where he spent the night. The next morning, the 18th, he left the hospital, signed on at the DSS to get his social security money, and then he went back to Nilsen's house and sat at his doorstep, waiting for him to come home from work. Now, when Nilsen arrived, he asked why he wasn't in hospital. Now, Malcolm replied that he was better now and they discharged him. Nilsen offered him a meal and they sat and watched telly. Now, Nilsen had some booze and Malcolm kept asking for some too, but Nilsen initially refused on the grounds that it wouldn't go well with his medicine. However, Malcolm just wouldn't let up, so Nilsen gave him some. After a couple of drinks, Malcolm passed out. And after an hour, Nilsen tried to wake him, but he was out cold. Now, he wondered if he should call an ambulance, but instead, he strangled him. He turned off the TV and then he just went to bed. The next day, not being bothered to put him under the floorboards, he stuck him under the sink and went to work. Now, this would be the last victim of Nilsen's at 195 Melrose Avenue before he moved to a new place at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. Now, that was in October of 1981. Now, this came about after his place was broken into and ransacked. Police attended Nilsen's place. They made a general observation, then left. All the while, they were standing on maybe 6 of Nilsen's kills. I mean, what the fuck? Didn't they smell rotting bodies in the house? I mean, you would smell it, wouldn't you? You'd have to. But maybe they smelt something real musty and off and just thought, everything looks fine. Burglary, nothing much we can do about it. Let's get out of this stinky place. Anyway, Nilsen was offered a place at Muswell Hill and money to relocate. So he'd have to dispose of these remaining bodies in the flat, and he did this by his usual method of burning them with tyres in the backyard. Now, the place at Muswell Hill wasn't like the Melrose Avenue place, which was a ground floor with a garden, so he could put stuff under floorboards and he had a garden to do his shit in. Muswell Hill was a 3-storey flat split up into several units. And Nilsen was on the top floor, so hiding bodies under the floorboards and burning them out in the back garden just wasn't an option. But this didn't deter him at all. He actually asked his old friend Martin Hunter Craig to move in permanently at this stage, but Martin declined because of the drinking and constant weirdness of Nilsen. He could handle it for a few days, but not on a permanent basis. Now, after moving in, the first couple of months, Nilsen took back many guys to his flats without killing him. Then on the 23rd of November, he attempted to strangle 23-year-old Paul Nobbs, who he met at the Golden Lion in Soho. Now, Nilsen attempted to strangle him, but for some reason stopped. Paul was unsure of what happened the next day when he woke, and he presented himself to hospital. Now, the doctor told him it looked like someone had tried to strangle him and said, just go to the cops and tell them. But he was afraid of being outed being gay, and so he just didn't do any of it. The next one to get away with his life was 21-year-old gay man and drag queen Carl Stotter, also known as Carla Le Fox. Now, Nilsen met him at the Black Cat pub in Camden Town. They went back to Nilsen's place where they continued to drink. When Carl passed out, Nilsen tried to strangle him with the zipper of a sleeping bag. Now, what's weird about this is that Carl passed out, but then he came back to consciousness after Nilsen's dog Bleep licked his face. Now, Nilsen tried to drown Carl, but that just didn't seem to work either. He then resuscitated Carl, and when he came to, Nilsen told him that he'd slept funny and that the zipper of the sleeping bag had got caught around his neck. In the end, and now this may be a couple of days Carl was sort of getting over this, he took Carl to the train station and let him go. Now, Carl did go to a hospital and had psychiatric help just from the distress of what had happened. Now, he told the doctor, the psychiatrist, how he felt he'd been attacked by strangulation and had his head plunged underwater, but he just couldn't remember a lot of it. The psychiatrist told him he was just making it all up and gave him heaps of drugs to try and get over it. Now, about a year later, he would be tracked down and interviewed by police. Now, Carl wasn't having crazy thoughts at all, and he would be very valuable in the witness box. But we'll get to that in a minute. Nelson's 13th victim and first at Muswell was petty criminal John Howlett. They met before, but they'd run into each other at the pub again. They ended up back at Nilsen's place. Nilsen seemed to tire of John's company, and he actually asked him to leave. John refused and got into Nilsen's bed. Now, Nilsen found a piece of furniture strapping and tried to strangle him, but there was a huge struggle, with Nilsen almost getting strangled himself. But then he ended up getting the upper hand. John went limp and Nilsen got off him. But then he sprang back to life, so Nilsen ended up strangling him again for a few more minutes. When his heart was still beating, Nilsen took him into the bath, filled it up and drowned him. Now, John Howlett would be the first body that Nilsen would dismember, as he no longer had floorboards to hide the bodies. To speed up disposing of the body, as he had a friend coming, probably Martin, he started to cut the body into little pieces and flush it down the dunny. Now, this took too long, so he started to boil the head, hands and feet, strip off the meat and then throw the bones into the bin. Now, some of the bones he threw over the fence. It looked like there was a disused waste area there. Other parts he would store in the house in plastic bags. Now, the 14th victim was Graham Allen, a homeless man that Nilsen had met in Shaftesbury Avenue near Chinatown in London. Nilsen had made him an omelette when he was back at his joint, and it looks like Graham had passed out while eating it. So he was just sitting there with half of it hanging out of his mouth. Like that, I suppose, like just drunk. Now, this seemed to piss Nilsen off, and he strangled him and then left his body in the bath for 3 days before dismembering him, as he did with John Howlett. Now, the problem was that no matter how fast he tried to flush all the body parts of boil heads and hands, he still had large amounts of rotting flesh stacking up in his flat in plastic bags. It was noticed also that Nilsen would always have his windows open just 24 hours, and they could always smell joss sticks or these incense sticks burning. Now, when Martin did come to visit, Martin said to Nilsen that the new place stunk the same as the last place. Now, Dennis just said the smell seemed to follow him around. Nilsen's 15th and final victim was drug addict Stephen Sinclair. Nilsen brought him a hamburger in Oxford Street, and Nilsen then offered for him to come back to his place. With Stephen high on booze and smack, Nilsen found it easy to strangle him, but it would be disposing of his body that would bring everything undone. You see, you can just flush away so much in body parts before the drains are going to clog up, especially in London. And clog up it did. First, the lower floors were having problems with toilets blocking, then the mid-level floors as well. I'm not sure if anyone was living on the mid-level floors at that time, but it was basically everything was backing up. So this meant plumbers would be called in, and Nilsen knew he might just get busted. First, a plumber was called, and he did the usual thing, like putting Drano down the dunny, put your hand down the S-band as well, I suppose, pull anything out, but that just didn't work. So the big guns were called in for a better look. Now, Dynarod, that was the company that was called in, as they have devices that can worm their way down the drain and just unclog shit, literally unclog shit. And electric eel type things, I think they are. They opened a manhole cover and they saw what they thought was flesh and bones. Now, they didn't call police straight away. It was starting to get dark. It was in the later afternoon. Instead, they decided to come back the next day and check it out properly without making a big fuss with police. I mean, they thought it might have just been animal bones, maybe chicken bones someone tried to flush. They'd never really entertained the idea that it would be human bones and flesh. Now, that night, Nilsen went down and took off the manhole cover and tried to pull out some of the flesh and bones. Now, he did get some of it out, and he even had the thought of getting some chicken bones and chicken flesh to replace it with, but he just didn't act on that thought that night. The next day, the dyno rod guy came back and he noticed that the manhole cover had been moved because there was a crack in it and it was now facing in a different direction. When they inspected the contents of the drain, they called police as it now looked like human bones. The cops came and took some of the flesh and bones to the local hospital for examination, and yes, the bones were from a human hand and the victim had been strangled. Now, the examiner knew the victim had been strangled because the police were asking, how do you know they've been strangled? Because the piece of flesh, just by luck, the piece that they had was from the neck area and it had ligature marks on it. Now, when police asked Nilsen if he knew anything about the body parts in the drain, when he was walking, just got back from work, at first he just went, hey, I don't know. But then he was told to stop messing about and to tell them where the rest of the body was. Now, he replied, in 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe next door, and I'll show you. When police entered the flat, they could already tell that the musty smell was just that stench of death. They opened a cupboard and saw plastic bags with air fresheners on them. They were full of various body parts. Now, Nilsen was taken downtown, and on the way he was asked if it was 1 body or 2. Now, he calmly replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. The remains in his flat were found to be from 3 bodies. One had been there about a week, the other about 9 months, and the third around 19 months. His place in 195 Melrose Avenue was also searched, with hundreds of bone fragments being found. When police interviewed Nilsen, he just wouldn't shut up. He went on and on about his crimes in as much detail as he could remember. Now, this was big news. Former cop and army butcher admitting to murdering 15 young men. It will also be found that several men had escaped with their lives. Some came forward after all the media publicity. And finally, Carl Stoddart, who the psychiatrist had said the attack he suffered was all in his mind, was contacted by police to tell him, "Nah, mate, it's real." So here's Carl. Suffers the initial attack. He goes to get treatment, but is told it's just all in his head. He's crazy. He spends a year trying to bend his mind into thinking it was all just a bad dream. And then he's told by police that it did really happen. Now, this pretty much fucked him up for life. Carl sadly passed away in 2013, aged 52. Now, Nilsen was charged with only 6 counts of murder as the police didn't have all the bodies, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Now, Carl's attempted murder charge didn't make it to court in time, but he was used as a prime witness. Now, in Des, the video, I noticed there was another, I think the Allen murder. He didn't make it onto the charge sheets as well. It's something to do with the law in England. But anyway, he was charged with 6. Now, what is disgusting about this trial is that when Carl did front up to court, his mum had just put a bit of makeup on him to give him some colour. Now, the press ridiculed him for being homosexual, for having makeup on, and for being a pathetic sight in the witness box. Now, this guy had such mental scars over this, and he's in a witness box having to recall what had happened. Of course, he looked a bit of a pathetic sight. He was even spat on by homophobes as he left the courtroom. Now, Nilsen would plead not guilty, but be found guilty on the 4th of November 1983 on all the murder charges and one of the attempted murder charges. He was sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. However, changes to the law meant his sentence would be changed to never to be released. But then Nilsen was able to get £55,000 to appeal this decision, which angered his victims and the community. In the end, he died on the 12th of May 2018, aged 72, while at Her Majesty's pleasure. It was at Full Sutton in York, a maximum security prison. Now, he had surgery at York Hospital at the time, and he ended up suffering a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal hemorrhage, which occurred following surgery to repair an abdominal aortic aneurysm. I think I got that better out than the audio version. Anyway, apparently it was a painful death. His autobiography has just been published. It's called The History of a Drowning Boy. So, Islanders, what a scary case. Now, Nilsen was just a dirtbag preying on the vulnerable in society, basically. He had an okay upbringing and he seemed to do okay in employment. He had no real reason to kill. They reckon, and so do I reckon, that the loss of his grandfather when he was young was imprinted in his mind, and that this was the reason he killed his lovers. He just didn't want them to leave. But he had so many that he didn't kill. So this doesn't make that much sense. Now, if the police are still looking into the case, maybe with new techniques they can find out the identities of those that Nilsen killed but are unknown. He was another case of one of those serial killers that goes about in society looking just like any other normal person. Even his best friend Martin didn't suspect a thing, even with that stink in his house. Maybe if Carl had been believed when he told doctors that he'd been attacked, that Nilsen may have been caught and a couple of lives saved. But it's crazy that when his house was broken into and ransacked, that first house, the police investigating were standing on the bodies of his victims hidden in the floorboards. There were 6 of them and they didn't notice the smell. I mean, for fuck's sake. And what did he smell like at work? You'd think the stink would just get into everything, his clothes and everything. But I don't know, maybe everyone in the office had BO, so no one noticed. Another crazy fact is that Nilsen sent a letter to the council complaining of blocked drains after he'd started flushing body parts down them. So, Islanders, I suggest you check out my UK mates at the Murder Mile podcast and the True Crime Enthusiast podcast. I'm sure further details they will have Also, I really do highly recommend the book Killing for Company by Brian Masters for a super deep dive. Now, Des, the TV show, was based on that book by Brian Masters. So you'll see lots of things in there. It's always better to read the book or listen to the book rather than watch the TV show. So before I go, big shout out to all my patrons. If you want to support the island, there's links in the description to Patreon, PayPal and merch. Please feel free to comment, like, subscribe, and I would truly appreciate if you share this channel. Hit the bell if you want to be notified. Well, that's it. I've been your host, Cambo. You've been watching True Crime Island. And as I always say, don't forget to delete your browser history. Good night and boom fuckalunga.